Hello there, welcome to day 2 of our adventures making a clothing item for IMVU using the clothing starter file. Not sure how well the stream will go today because it's very hot and the computer is working overtime. Thanks Colin, that was a comment on YouTube. So today I will be monitoring comments on a different device just in case they come through. Because Restream doesn't, or YouTube doesn't like Restream. Which is sad. But anyway, right, so where were we? So this is where we got to yesterday. Whoops. All these channels that have to be monitored. Oh, that's interesting. They don't necessarily make it easy to mute or pause or stop a live broadcast on mobile devices. So for those of you doing any streaming of your own, that's something to watch out for. Anyway, where were we? So yesterday we got as far as this, and it occurred to me this looks like another one of our toilet paper items. So we could open where are the toilet paper ones? Oh, there we go. So we've got these silly toilet paper items made from toilet paper. So this new one that we're working on could also be toilet paper, just giant sheets of it. So if that were the case, what we could do with this is leave it as is for now, but what we can do is add a material to it. So we have to reset the view. So we're in viewport display or viewport overlays or options, scale to 100, because Blender doesn't keep the settings for each workspace. It uses a different workspace between each, different settings for each workspace. And clip size 2500. 1. So now we can see the entire model or mesh. So what we can do is select it, and we're going to just apply a material and then use our previously used toilet roll texture. So select our mesh, click the new button, and that will create a material instance and populate it. So click, and then we'll call this TP roll space square bracket 0 close space. So we end up with that. That's our IMVU compliant or compatible material, and it's actually the number that's appended at the end that's the important part, not the label. That can be anything, and or it can be the same thing reused over and over and over again. And so long as you have a different numerical append at the end, IMVU will know what to do with it. It will treat it as a distinct material. Right, so in the material editor we need to just drop an image texture node. Drop that into place and we can connect it up, color output, base color input, and it'll go black because there's nothing associated with it. So we want to use our previously utilized image. So click the open button, and then we need to browse to wherever it is. Toilet paper, toilet paper, toilet paper. Where is it? Should be in here somewhere. Most odd. So this is obviously what happens when you have lots of projects. So if you were a texture artist, it would be even worse. Is it a furniture item? That's really weird. Where is it? Oh, well, that worked. Oh, there it is. Toilet paper, JPEG. So load that in, select, load it in, and it appears on the mesh because the mesh had its own default UV map assigned to it. So what we need to do with this is update the UV map. So now that we've got a image associated with the material, what we want to do in UV editing, and again we have to reset the view. So viewport overlays, and they differ slightly because we're in a different view mode. But scale 100, view 2500, 1, switch to texture preview, and then select all. So that shows us the UV map as it was originally, essentially. So what we want to do with this is just unwrap it. UV unwrap. That creates this very squiggly line. Angle base, conformal. That's not that much better. So for things like this, what we have to do is manually adjust the UV map. So we're going to use for this these tools, the manipulation tools. So we've got move, rotate, scale, and then the universal that combines all of them together. So select the universal, and we get this widget. We get this widget that gives us a couple of, well, it's a 2G. It gives us a 2D representation of some of the things that we can do to our UVs once they are selected. So the edges, so if you don't know, the edges allow you to manipulate the UVs in those specific directions. So we can click, drag, and we can see what's going on the mesh as we're doing that. So that's directional. Then in the corners we've got bi-directional, so those scale out on the diagonal essentially. So it scales out, so it doesn't matter what you do to the widget itself, it always just scales diagonally relative to the overall UV map. And then the bit in the middle, that's the manipulation handle. We grab that, and again we can see what it's doing in the 3D preview. And then this node sticking out the top, that's our rotate node, and that allows us to rotate the selection. So if you hold Control down whilst you're doing that, it snaps to the increment when you're rotating, or the grid when you are scaling. So what we have to do with this is basically start, so switch to vertex. So we've got vertex, whoops, vertex, edge, face, island. We've got an island currently selected, which is the entire UV section. Vertex, just grab one of those, move it and just pin it. And then with that pinned, so that's the P key or UV pin. And what that does is it locks that UV in place, so we can unwrap again. Where is it? There it is. Oh, it's not doing anything this time. So that looks like that's the map that's going to give us. So what we can do is just select the individual UVs, select them, press the G key so we can move them, and let's pin this selection. So UV pin. We can try unwrapping again, see what that does. So that changes the UV a little bit. What we want to try and do so if that's the that's that, is that the bottom of the top, so that's the back. So let's pin those three. And we can use that as a generic or general width. Whoops. So we pin these, unwrap again. So that's the U key for the shortcut. And you can see that as we're doing this, it's changing the shape of the UV overall, but what we're trying to do is just unwrap this so that we can basically get a straightened form out of it that will fit the entire width of this section, which is the toilet paper. There isn't a quick way to do this, unfortunately. So let's grab all of those so we can use our selection tools. Click, hold, and we get the options. Selection box. Left click, drag, and we can select multiples. Or you can just use the shortcut keys, and they behave slightly differently depending on what it is that you're doing. So if you press the B key, B for beta, you get the selection box manipulator. Pin those, unwrap. So we're starting to get our paper shape or sheets of paper. Whoops, undo, pin, unwrap. So don't necessarily need to work on the inside loop, because it'll straighten itself out relative to the layout that is being created. Pin those, unwrap. So that's the rotate key, the R key. R for Roger. And although the points, the vertices are pinned, we can still manipulate them. We can select them and we can still manipulate them. It's just that unwrapping won't have any effect. Whoops. Unwrap. Missed one. Unwrap. So once we've got that loosely sorted out, select it all. Grab, move out, and we want the scale widget, or what we want to do, whoops, is scale that up so that our sheet is the full width of our mesh. We don't necessarily have to so we need to make sure, so we're going to have to make some minor adjustments to the UV map, because we don't necessarily need to make it the full width of the available space that we're using. But we have to be careful not to cause any overlap. So we have these sections that need to be adjusted relative to the overall UV, which is slightly larger at this side. Oops. It is very hot today. So we've got another bit there. So we're using the shortcut keys for this. So whilst we're in the UV editor, on the main keyboard we've got the number 1, which selects vertexes, So we've got our options that we were talking about earlier, but we've got the shortcut keys for those. 1 vertexes, 2 edges, 3 faces, and 4 islands. So we can quickly toggle back and forth between the two. Without wasting too much repetitiveness or being repetitive. So scan that along. So to do that, what we're doing is using the shortcut key, which is the G key, to manipulate or move, and then we're pressing the X key to lock it to an axis or axes, which is the x-axis, left, right. We can do the same thing with the Y key, which is up, down. Hey Gerard, or Gerard, didn't see you there. That's on YouTube. So that's a very basic. So that's the tail end. So that's our material and texture assigned to our mesh. Of course, that's not the end of it. But if you wanted to leave this as basically sheets of paper, so it's another toilet roll accessory, wouldn't necessarily need to do anything else more to that. Just shift that out of the way, it's bugging me. So it's another novelty item, shall we say. But you wouldn't necessarily need to do anything complicated to that. For the UVs, just stretch it out using pins. So we're selecting individual vertexes and pinning them to lock their position, which we can then use to help us straighten out the UV relative to the sheet of paper or the sheets of paper. So in this context, that's fine. That works fine. For more complicated objects, obviously it's going to differ depending on what it is that you are texturing to the mesh or what's supposed to be on here. So if it's a pattern, if it's something that's got an obvious pattern, you have to be careful about how the UVs unwrap to prevent the pattern from distorting too much. So if this included some text, for example, you'd have to watch out for the text not distorting too much. So let's go back to layout. Smooth shade that. Object, shade smooth. And then just let's save that. Save as. So this is number 5. I'll just call this toilet paper. Just checking comments. Right, so let's do this as a novelty item. So it's a novelty toilet paper. So what we want to do then, what we've got to do, so this is going to be the issue with these types of items generally. And these are very tricky because unlike clothing items, so let's just hide this for now. So unlike clothing items, you're generally restricted to the shape that you are using as your template or around which you are building your clothing items. So the structure of your mesh is generally going to follow a relatively logical pattern. Or a formal pattern, I should say. It follows the avatar like so. And these are relatively straightforward to articulate. Hi Frenzy. These are relatively straightforward to articulate because they do follow the avatar. Why aren't my thingies not? Oh, is that Blender frozen up? Hang on. Oof, not sure what happened there. Blender froze. Where were we? Oh, structure, yeah, so with clothing, we're generally following the structure of the mesh, but with these kinds of things, where you're going across the structure, they can be quite a challenge to weight paint to the mesh because of the fact that they don't follow the structure of the mesh. You can make it do that, but it means that you're adding a lot more structure than may necessarily be needed in order to do whatever it is that you want to do. So what we need to look at doing so we want to add some loops now along the length. So we're going to add two sets, one at the top, one at the bottom. So let's start pushing some vertexes around. So we're basically just imagining this as just sheets of paper, toilet paper. So it's flexible, but not that flexible. It's not like cloth. So we have to kind of imagine how it's shaped and formed as it drapes around and over the torso. But what we've got to keep in mind whilst we're doing this is that we are going across the body. Whoops. We are going across the torso instead of aligned axially to it. So we are off axes. And we've also got to keep in mind the underlying structure of the avatar. So the avatar is quite, relative to what we're doing with this mesh, the avatar is quite dense structurally. So I'll just disable that, go back into wireframe. Hide the skeleton for a moment, because we don't need that. So we have to figure out, in order to get this to eventually deform well with the mesh, I won't say properly because that's not quite the right word, but in order for this to deform well with the avatar, we eventually will have to add structure in place that replicates the structure of the avatar. So from this angle we can see that there are a number of loops that we need to be mindful of, because as we said, or as we were discussing in the previous video, where there's the distortion that's caused because of the way that the butt cheeks are physically structured, and it causes those very hard shapes to form, which can mean that when you try to when you weight paint your mesh to the butt cheeks, even if you have the same sort of structure in place, so you could have an edge that's equally subdivided to match the avatar. So let's say this is the avatar and this is your mesh. The way that all the weight painting works, or the weight values, and the way that IMVU have actually articulated this skeleton to get the avatar to pose, we wouldn't necessarily get a one-to-one correlation between all these segments, and we end up with bits poking out. So to limit that or mitigate it, we've got to keep in mind that as discussed yesterday, what we want to be doing is slowly adding detail to the mesh so that we're not overblowing it from the start and putting too much structuring that causes problems for us when we start to weight paint this. But at the same time, we need to have enough structure in place that we can accommodate the avatar deforming. So for this section of the arm, so we've got our loop that goes across there, and we've got our loop that goes across there, So this loop of the avatar is covered with this section, but this one essentially is covered by this one. So in order to accommodate this loop, we would necessarily have to add a loop in here, and we may even have to split that in order to get it to deform properly. But we don't want to add that now. What we want to be doing is just adding the basic stuff that we need, or the basic structure that we need, that's absolutely necessary in order to get the deformation that we're looking for. And then later we can actually add more structure to accommodate how the avatar is deforming underneath it. So choosing your poison, whether it's vertexes, edges or faces, it's just a question now of shaping the mesh so that it looks like toilet paper, giant sheets of toilet paper. From a personal preference point of view, I find vertexes easier to work with, because if we use edges, so what we want to do, well, what we want to do here is just try pulling out this edge to make this look like it's a sheet of paper that's resting against the hips down at the bottom and just flopping outwards. So with vertexes, all you have to do is just select the vertex and just shift it into place. But with edges, let's undo all of that, see if we can go back far enough. With edges, you have to select the edge, move it into position, and then rotate it however you want. So you might be doing a bit more work than is necessary than if you were using just vertexes. So it's personal preference, choose your poison, and just manipulate the mesh as you imagine giant rolls of toilet paper to deform and distort around the avatar. So what we can do here is add a loop cut just to accommodate the sides a little bit. Let's save this actually. File, save as. 6. I think we're going to have to keep, we're going to have to make this stream a little short today, because the PC is spinning up quite hard because it's hot. So I don't know if the fan noise is being picked up. Right, so there's the back. We've got to accommodate the butt cheeks. We don't want to be too close to those. So add one in the back. So basically all we're doing is just working our way down down the mesh. And just shaping it. Relative to it looking like our giant sheets of toilet paper. Because what we could do is save over that file, save as. Just looking at this. This is one of the other things as well, obviously, with creating, is that you don't necessarily start out, you don't necessarily end up with whatever it was that you thought you were going to end up with, or what you started out with, because so that's that toilet roll holder. One of the other ones. So that was one of the other ones. Then did we do another one? I think we did another one. Open, don't save. Oh well, we've got the bling fling. That's an animated pose. But for clothing, I think that was it. But oh, wrong one. So this is, oh, it's all joined together. So the whole rolls are held in place. The rolls are held in place by this inner thing, and it wraps over itself inside this toilet roll, so it's hidden inside the roll. But what we could do it makes the mesh very complicated, but I was just looking at this thinking, I wonder if what we could do is somehow, so this back end just drops down to the bottom at the moment, but what if we drop it down the back, loop it, and then drop it, so it loops and holds these sections in place, so it looks as if it's held in place, and it's designed like that, so it's held in place by the loops. That makes it very complicated as a mesh, but what did I do? I did something that did something like that, but I can't remember what it was. Otherwise the mesh is kind of magic because it's holding itself up, which we don't necessarily want to imply that it's magic toilet paper, because everyone would want that then. I have to think about that. That's so what I think what we'll do is just continue down the mesh and sort out the length of it, and then maybe in the next stream, actually, because we'll keep this one quite short. So in the next stream, what we might do is then try and do something like that, where the object itself is relatively straightforward. It's just if you imagine this in real life, it's just a strip. But wrapping that around yourself is easy peasy. Wrapping something like that around a mesh, a 3D mesh, is pretty complicated, even though it's a relatively simple, straightforward object. Because the way that the mesh is deforming is obviously defined not just by the avatar, so we're not just following the avatar structure. We also have to accommodate the mesh itself. So if we wrap this section around there and then go behind this and then come back up and go back down behind, that's going to do something. Well, it'll crinkle it. So like in this section, let's just hide the text. Hide text. So we've got a slightly wonky section here, which is relatively thick because it's not being compressed by the holes of the rolls. So the structure gets a little tighter as it goes through the rolls, but we can make it much more relaxed out in the open because there's nothing compressing it. So it's a bit fatter as a shape. So the mesh is adjusted to accommodate that, or to illustrate that, I should say. So the mesh is changed to illustrate that point. So you get a better sense of the impression that the sheet chain has been scrunched up to fit through the tube, but because there's no pressure on the bit that's visible, it can be less, it can be more relaxed. And the same applies to if we loop this, back section so it comes back up and then goes back down, that then may mean that we scrunch this section up tighter, because the act of manipulating the paper, the sheets, into doing that, into looping around something, causes it to compress. But because that compresses and it's looping round this section, this now compresses. Whoops. So that now compresses. So we then have to adjust, we have to adjust the mesh to compensate for whatever is going on in this section. So it's a bit esoteric, I'm not quite sure which one. But you're not just draping a mesh around an avatar to fit the avatar's form. Basically, that's what we're saying. It's not just something that you are draping around in the same way that a clothing item, a shirt, doesn't matter what it is. So a shirt isn't just this. If the shirt has pockets, if the shirt has a pattern, or as with the skirt, the pleated skirt that we did before, open, so where is that? Pleated skirt, there it is. So adding details like the pleats then defines how certain areas of the mesh behave in response to the pleats themselves. So it's not just a shape that's cut into the mesh, it's actually something that defines the behavior of the mesh, well, aside from the weight painting and deformation, but it defines what else happens, to the mesh further up. So when we're making our structures, we have to keep all of this sort of stuff in mind, because we're not just, in this case, we're not just making a skirt with pleats in it. We have to think of, well, what's going to happen to the mesh structure further up, even though these pleats are all the way down here. Do they affect what's going on up here? So it's the same with our toilet paper and this section at the back. So just thinking about this from the point of view of, oh well, let's just wrap this around here so that we can get the toilet paper to go through it like that. But in doing that, in creating that structure or that effect, that impression of something, we have to think about the structure itself in terms of what that actually means if you were actually to do that. So if you got some big sheets of toilet paper and wrapped it around yourself, what would happen? How would it structure itself if you were to actually do something like that? And that, accommodating that idiosyncrasy of the object, that makes or breaks the item in terms of not whether it's just believable, but whether it makes the item kind of ground itself in reality, even though this is, you know, virtual. It's 3D digital fantasy, etc., etc., but it still conforms to the expectations that we have of the mesh and the material that it might be made from. So that's it's a bit esoteric in terms of what that means. But again, this is stuff that you need to know that nobody's teaching you. Nobody is talking about this sort of stuff, because it's just about, all that's interested of most people is just pressing buttons. But if you want to advance your skills, you have to think about these things in terms of, you have to think about the interplay and the interrelationships between whatever it is that you are making and whatever it is that you are trying to represent. And it takes you to the next step, and it's important, but it's something that you learn from a skill point of view in terms of how you actually do it. But in terms of just being aware of it, if you can get your mind around it early on, it helps you develop your skills in a way that will it'll make you progress faster, because you become aware of much more broader concerns, I should say, I guess is probably the best way. you're more broadly aware of what's going on than just making an object. It'll all make sense eventually. So, with that in mind, that does mean that we may have to adjust this section of the mesh to compensate for the fact that in the next stream we will loop that round. So let's just continue on down the mesh. Let's pull this in tight or tighter. So I have to allow for the legs to deform a little bit. So we do kind of want to, we're keeping the general sort of paperishness. So it's going to be relatively stiff, but still relatively flexible. If we want the sheets to remain as sheets, but we've also got to make sure that we accommodate the underlying avatar. We don't want to be too close to it because of the issues that we were talking about yesterday, and just a few minutes ago, where the mesh deforms and it causes the avatar to clip through. Whoops. So we need to add a loop cut here. And shift this one back a little bit so we can select the loop. So as discussed yesterday, that's Alt right click, or make sure you have at least 2 vertexes selected in the direction of the loop you want to select. And then is it select loops, edge loop, and it'll select the edge loop that you want. It won't do it with single vertexes because it doesn't know which direction you want the loop to be selected, because obviously there's 2. It's that one and that one. So if you're in vertex mode, you have to select 2. If you're an edge, just select the edge and it'll know. Add a loop here. And then we're almost done for this part, and then we'll continue on tomorrow. Might have to do some investigation into giant sheets of toilet paper. Right, so that'll do for now and today. So save that, save as. And then we shall continue this on the next stream. Hopefully it'll be a bit cooler for the computer to cope with. So that's all we've got so far. So tomorrow what we'll take a look at is actually looping. So we'll take this section that goes behind here and we'll try looping it around the outside, then dropping it back down, doing the same thing at the bottom, come out down there. And then that means we'll be able to do something with these sections that we can maybe scrunch it up a little bit in the same way that we've done, or that was done, for the toilet paper chain. So it's all scrunched up toilet paper, but maybe we can do something like that. Right, so yes, we'll call it quits there. And we shall see you on the next stream, and hopefully it'll be a bit cooler. Right, thanks for lurking, lurkers. Thanks for commenting, Colin and Jared on YouTube. And we shall see you on the next one. So bye for now, everyone.